Living in a medieval castle may sound like a romantic dream, but the reality was more rulebook than fairy tale. Imagine stepping into the shadowy stone archway of a medieval fortress, your boots still damp from the muddy road outside, your breath visible in the chill air even in spring, and every sound of your movement echoing through ancient stone halls. The first thing you'd notice wouldn't be the grandeur, it would be the smell. The cold, mossy damp of stone that has absorbed centuries of cooking fires, tallow smoke, mildew, wet wool, and horse sweat. You're not in a home as much as you are in a machine, an engine of survival, defense, hierarchy, and habit. And like any complex machine, the castle runs on rules, many of them unwritten, all of them unforgiving, and before anything else, there's one guiding principle to living in a medieval castle. Don't touch anything unless you're told to. Medieval castles were not designed for convenience or comfort. They were designed for control. Their walls were thick, their doors small, and their furnishing sparse and strategically placed. Almost nothing belonged to you unless you were the lord or lady of the keep. If you were a guest, a servant, or even a lower noble, the unspoken expectations were constant and constraining. You didn't put your hands on tapestries. You didn't lean on windowsills. You didn't lounge on a bench unless you were invited to. Almost everything had a purpose, a rank, and a ritual attached to it. And heaven help you if you ignored those. Expectations stopped the moment you crossed the threshold into the castle's great gate. You entered not just a building, but a social order etched into the stone itself. Even the layout of the castle was a kind of silent disciplinarian. The outer bailey was open to movement and work. This was where the animals were kept. Where carts were unloaded, where blacksmiths hammered and servants swept, you might be allowed to loiter here, though not without being noticed. But go beyond the inner gatehouse, through the heavy portcullis and the warren-like passageways into the inner ward, and you were now in a sacred domain, the private realm of the ruling family, and every stone wall seemed to whisper, "You don't belong." In the great hall, the beating heart of castle life, everything had a place and a purpose. The lord's high table sat at one end of the room, usually on a raised platform so that no one could forget who was in charge. You didn't sit there unless you were told to, and even glancing too long could mark you out as presumptuous. Servants lined the walls, not to rest, but to stand ready. Tapestries hung for insulation, as well as decoration, but they were not to be touched. The fire in the central hearth roared in winter, and the heat it gave off wasn't yours to enjoy. It warmed the room for the noble family. And if you happened to benefit by standing nearby while waiting for instructions, consider it luck, not entitlement. You see, the physical items in the castle were deeply bound up with rank. The chair a noble sat on was not just furniture, it was a throne, even if humble in construction. The goblet they drank from, the spoon they used, the carved chest at the foot of their bed, each item was symbolic and guarded. Touching the wrong thing could be interpreted as a challenge to authority, or at the very least, a grave breach of decorum. In a world where personal space was rare and privacy even rarer, respect for possessions was paramount, especially when most people owned so little. And here's the paradox. For all the rules, castles were not clean, organized places by modern standards. They were chaotic, smoky, loud, and dark. Torches guttered in iron sconces, rushes and herbs. Strewn on the floor covered filth rather than cleaned it. Dogs wandered freely indoors. Children cried and servants scurried. But amidst this chaos, there was still a fierce and elaborate code of behavior. A world where you might be elbow to elbow with nobility, but still utterly beneath them. And touching something as innocuous as a lord's cloak, perhaps, thrown over. A stool to dry might be seen as either theft or insolence, depending on who witnessed it. Living in a castle meant understanding the sacred geometry of space. Some rooms were neutral zones, the kitchens, the stables, the armory, though even there, specialists ruled their own domains. The cook ran the kitchen like a ship. The master of horse controlled the stables with feudal pride. You didn't enter Their spaces without cause, and you never handled their tools. But the most sacred space, ironically, was not the chapel, though it too had its own taboos. It was the Lord's private chamber. The solar, as it was called in Norman castles, was off limits to almost everyone. To be invited into the solar meant trust and favor. To enter without invitation meant punishment. And no one sat on the Lord's bed. Furniture was rare and valuable. Most people sat on stools or the floor. Benches were communal, and you sat according to rank. Even the act of sitting down had social weight. If a knight or noble entered, and you didn't rise, you were being insolent. But if you rose too slowly, you were being sluggish. There were right ways to carry yourself, right ways to address others, and right ways to behave near the objects that belonged to the household. You learned early that your hands should stay, folded or at your sides unless instructed otherwise. For children, growing up in the castle meant absorbing this code like osmosis. Boys training as pages or squires knew better than to mess with weaponry on display. A ceremonial sword hanging on the wall wasn't just for show. It belonged to a man who might cut you down with it if you disrespected the space. Girls and noble. Households learned quickly that embroidery hoops, combs, and fine cloth were guarded treasures. A misplaced hand on the wrong piece of linen might lead to a scolding, or worse, a beating dot. And if you were a guest from outside, navigating these rules could be even harder. Castle hospitality was sacred, but conditional. You were expected to behave with humility and gratitude. You brought gifts if you could. You didn't explore on your own. You didn't open doors. You didn't peek behind curtains. Every step was guided by someone else, and you were watched more closely than you might realize. Servants doubled as informants. Minor infractions were noted, and what might seem like a harmless inspection, a curious glance at a wall carving or a moment spent admiring a chest, could lead to whispers that you were getting ideas above your station. Even leisure had rules. Hunting horns, board games, harp music, these were reserved for the right hours, the right people, and the right moods. If you were found lounging in the wrong room with the wrong object, perhaps a carved gaming piece or an expensive cloak, tossed aside, there might be consequences. These rules weren't always written down. They were enforced by habit, by glaring looks, by sudden silence in the room, and sometimes by more direct means. The line between a faux pas and a crime was dinner in a castle, then outside of it, and we haven't even begun to talk about religious objects. Many castles had chapels, and even those without full-time clergy still observed holy days and rituals. Touching a missal, a crucifix, or even a holy candle without being ordained, or at least very trusted, was blasphemous. Prayers had rules. Kneeling had rules. Fasting had rules. And each season brought new expectations. Lent, Advent, Eastertide each reshaped the rhythms of castle life and dictated new behavioral standards. The unspoken fear beneath all this regulation was disorder. Castles, for all their might and stone, were fragile ecosystems. The thin line between order and chaos ran through every hallway. A single servant forgetting to knock. A guest leaning on a tapestry. A child climbing a stair not meant for them. These weren't just accidents. They were cracks in the authority of the household. And in an age where authority was everything, even small breaches were treated seriously. The entire system depended on people knowing their place and behaving accordingly. So the first and last lesson of castle life was stay in your place and keep your hands to yourself, and yet there was something almost comforting in this rigidity. For those who learned the rules, life in the castle could be stable, even predictable. The days had rhythms, the meals had structure. The people around you were like pieces on a chessboard. You always knew who was who. You knew how to behave, how to dress, when to speak, and where to sleep. And in a world full of war, famine, and plague, that predictability was rare and precious dot. So the next time you picture medieval castle stone towers rising over green hills, banners flapping in the breeze, remember that behind every majestic U was a rigid code of behavior. Behind every carved wooden door was a dozen invisible lines you were never to cross. And if you were lucky enough to be inside the walls, your job was not to question or explore. It was simply to exist without disruption, to survive the hierarchy, to obey the silence of stone, and above all else, don't touch anything from the outside. A medieval castle often appears like a single monolithic structure, solid, unchanging, and unified. But inside it was a living, breathing hierarchy built, not just of stone and mortar, but of roles, ranks, and invisible lines that no one dared to cross. A castle wasn't simply a home or a fortress. It was a map of power etched into physical space. Every doorway, stair, and chamber had meaning. And who you were decided where you could go, what you could touch, and where you would sleep. Castles were designed deliberately. They weren't just built to defend against enemies. They were designed to remind everyone inside them exactly where they stood in the social order. This hierarchy wasn't flexible or theoretical. It was spatial. It was vertical. The higher up in the castle you lived or worked, the higher your rank. Quite literally, power lived above you. And everyone below knew a dot at the very bottom of the social pyramid were the servants and laborers. These were the cooks, cleaners, porters, stable hands, and general workers who kept the daily rhythm of the castle turning. Their living quarters were usually near the base of the structure, often crammed into rooms close to the kitchens or outer walls. These spaces were damp, smoky, and noisy. Privacy was non-existent, beds were often shared, and the scent of boiling meat or smoke was a constant companion. You might think that being inside the castle walls provided some protection, and it did, but that safety came at the price of enduring relentless toil, uncomfortable living conditions, and constant scrutiny. Servants were expected to be invisible until needed. They moved quietly through side passages and narrow stairs. They avoided eye contact with those above them. Many castles were designed with what were called servant stairs, steep, narrow staircases tucked into corners, allowing workers to appear and disappear without interrupting the noble view. Servants did not enter the grand halls unless they were serving. They did not linger in corridors, and they never, ever ascended to the upper chambers without a direct order. To move vertically in the castle without permission was not just a breach of privacy, was seen as a violation of the social order itself. Above the servants were the specialists, the blacksmiths, falconers, huntsmen, scribes, and stewards. These individuals were still considered part of the working class, but they carried more authority. A steward might oversee the entire domestic functioning of the castle and could have his own chambers, usually located slightly higher, perhaps near the Great Hall. They weren't grand rooms, but they offered a touch more space, better air, and a sliver of autonomy. The steward, in particular, was a powerful figure, often the go-between for the lord and the rest of the castle. Even noble guests might be handled by a steward first, rather than dealing directly with the lord or lady dot next in the spatial ladder, were the soldiers and guards. These men didn't usually live in luxury, but their proximity to weapons and the walls gave them both responsibility and access. Many lived in garrisons or barracks rooms carved into the sides of the curtain wall. While modest, these spaces were above the outer bailey, and their elevation gave both a literal and symbolic sense of importance. Soldiers guarded gates, manned towers, and patrolled the walls. While they didn't mix with the nobility, they did exist in a sphere of visibility and danger that set them apart from servants. In times of siege, their role expanded drastically, and so did their access to inner areas of the castle, at least temporarily. Then came the knights and household. Retainers, men of rank and training, often of noble birth themselves, though not at the top. A castle lord might have several knights who pledged loyalty to him. They lived more comfortably, perhaps in upper chambers off the inner ward. These spaces had real beds, better ventilation, and sometimes even writing desks or small hearths. They weren't private in the modern sense. Castles rarely had true solitude, but they were distinct. A knight might be granted a room with a window, a heavy wooden door, and enough space to store his armor. That alone marked him as important, Within the same upper middle tier were the noble family's extended relations, younger sons, cousins, unmarried sisters, or widowed aunts. Depending on the family's wealth and the size of the castle, these relatives might have their own chambers, or they might be assigned to smaller solar rooms connected to the main hall. Their position was tricky. They lived among power, but rarely held it. They were expected to support the authority of the ruling lord or lady without ever challenging it. Their chambers were a step below the central solar or lord's suite, but far above the crowded servant quarters or open great hall dot at the very top of the structure. Both literally and figuratively were the chambers of the lord and lady. Were typically placed in the uppermost levels of the keep or central tower, not just for privacy, but to reflect their status. These private rooms were larger, better appointed, and, crucially, more secure. Windows might be glazed, if the family was wealthy. The bed would have fine linens and canopies, and the furniture would be ornate, often imported or inherited. Tapestries hung from the walls for insulation and display. The Lord's chamber might include a private writing desk, a personal chapel, or even a latrine. For the lady, her chamber might be connected to the solar and upper room that received sunlight and acted as a private receiving area or sewing room. The solar was often the most exclusive room in the entire castle, accessible only to the noble. Family and their closest confidants, it was a space of semi-public gatherings, family meetings, and private business. In many ways, it functioned as a kind of office and sitting room. But even here, hierarchy ruled. If you were invited to the solar, it was an honor. If you entered uninvited, it was a grave offense. And only the most trusted individuals, advisors, confessors, or high-ranking guests were ever permitted to cross its threshold without fanfare. The spatial hierarchy of the castle extended even to how rooms were used. The Great Hall was the most public of all noble spaces. It was the center of communal dining, announcements, celebrations, and justice. During the day, it teemed with servants and visitors. At night, it quieted, and sometimes guests or guards would sleep along its benches or on its straw-covered floor. But while the hall was open, it was still organized. The high table was for the lord and honored guests. The side tables were for lower-ranking nobles or retainers. And everyone else ate lower down, often literally at floor level. The chapel was another space deeply marked by hierarchy. While all were welcome to pray, not all were allowed to sit in the same place. Nobles had front pews or cushioned kneeling benches. Servants stood at the back. Some chapels even had wooden screens dividing the space, ensuring that the social lines remained visible, even before God got, and then there was the tower. Many castles had a central tower or keep, sometimes called the dungeon, that served as both stronghold and living space. This tower was the ultimate symbol of hierarchical living. At the bottom, stores and servants. One level up, soldiers or squires. One more level, visiting knights or the steward. And at the very top, the lord's suite, often including a bedroom, an office, and sometimes a small chamber for his wife. You literally had to climb to reach power. Even access to the outdoors was stratified. The garden might be reserved for the lady and her companions. The wall walk used by guards for patrols was off limits to most residents. The stables were the domain of the master of horse, and hunting grounds outside the castle were strictly regulated. Poaching wasn't just a crime, it was a challenge to noble authority. Servants rarely, if ever, saw the full castle. Many lived and worked entirely within the kitchens, sculleries, or stables, never once setting foot in the solar or upper chambers. Children born into servant families might work their entire lives within 50 yards of their birthplace and never climb the tower steps. The hierarchy was not just vertical, it was enclosing. This physical stratification shaped behavior as well. People spoke differently depending on their location. A servant in the kitchens could speak more freely, joke, and move quickly. But once they ascended toward the hall or chambers, their steps slowed, their voices quieted, their posture changed. Every upward movement was a shift toward deference, and just as important as who lived where was who didn't live there at all. Castles were exclusive by nature. Most people, peasants, travelers, traders, never entered a castle unless summoned. The outer bailey might host livestock and temporary camps during festivals, but the inner ward was closed to outsiders. The gatehouse served as the border. Inside, the world was tightly controlled. Entry required purpose. Residence required rank. Even in death, the hierarchy endured. Burial locations within the castle grounds, if allowed at all, were assigned by status. The noble family might be interred in a small crypt below the chapel, while servants were buried in unmarked plots outside the walls. The very soil you rested in was dictated by your place in life. Ultimately, the castle was not just a building. It was a system, a vertical village built of status, space, and unspoken rules. The walls were thick not only to keep invaders out, but to keep everyone else firmly in their place. And the higher you lived, the clearer it became. You were not just above the others in comfort. You were above them in purpose, in perception, and power dot. And so every stair, every hallway, every chamber told a story, not just of architecture, but of authority. To walk through a castle was to walk through a social order etched in stone, one you couldn't escape, one you couldn't challenge, one you could only survive if you remembered where you belonged. When people picture a medieval castle, the image that often comes to mind is a grand hall lit by flickering torchlight, with long tables piled high with roasted meats, nobles laughing over goblets of wine, and minstrels playing songs in the background. It's a scene from countless films and fairy tales, and like most fairy tales, it's partly true and mostly misleading. The Great Hall did exist, and feasts were held there. But for the vast majority of people living in or passing through a castle, the Great Hall was not a place of fun or freedom. It was a stage, and unless you were sitting at the high table, you were only ever part of the background dot at its core. The Great Hall was not a dining room. It was a throne room, a courtroom, a council chamber, and a performance space all rolled into one. Everything that happened there had a purpose, and most of that purpose revolved around reinforcing authority. The Great Hall was designed to impress and intimidate. The ceilings soared high overhead, often supported by massive timber beams. The walls hung with tapestries that told carefully chosen stories of ancestry or conquest, and at the far end stood the high table, usually raised on a dais, beneath a decorative canopy or cloth of state, where the lord and his family sat above. Everyone else, literally and symbolically, dot. This arrangement was not just for decoration. It was a constant visual reminder of who held power and who did not. When guests entered the hall, their eyes were drawn immediately to the high table. And as they walked past the lower benches where knights, stewards, and lesser guests sat, they were reminded with every step of the social ladder they were climbing. Reaching the high table meant status, approval, and proximity to authority. Being denied that seat, or being seated far down the hall, was its own kind of message. The daily rhythm of the Great Hall followed strict patterns. Meals were served according to a set schedule, and who ate when and where was carefully managed. The lord and lady would enter last, after everyone else had assembled. All would rise when they entered. No one ate before the lord began. No one spoke loudly unless the lord initiated conversation. There might be music or a storyteller, but again, only by command. Nothing was spontaneous. And then there was the food. While feasts were lavish affairs, especially on holy days or celebrations, the average meal in the Great Hall was more restrained, though still structured around spectacle. Food was brought in by servants in a procession, often on platters, carved from wood or pewter, arranged in courses, but not everyone got the same fare. The dishes grew simpler as they moved down the hall. While the high table might enjoy spiced game meat, fresh bread, and sugared fruits, the lower benches were often given stews, porridge, or coarse bread. This culinary gradient was no accident. It reinforced rank. Even in shared space, division was key. Servants operated like clockwork within the hall. Some carried food from the kitchens, others poured wine or ale from large pitchers, and still others waited with towels and basins, so nobles could wash their hands before and after eating. Their movements had to be precise and discreet. Dropping a dish, spilling a drink, or speaking out of turn could result in punishment or worse, dismissal. These workers were never part of the feast. They might be surrounded by food, music, and conversation, but they were ghosts in the room, invisible unless needed. Guests were expected to behave with equal restraint. This was not a tavern. You didn't drink to excess. You didn't laugh too loudly. You certainly didn't argue with your neighbor or comment on the food unless asked. Every action was a reflection of the host. Bad manners were not just personal. Failings, they were insults to the lord of the castle. To cause disruption was to challenge the order of the hall, and thus the order of the household. Even knightsmen trained for battle could find themselves humbled by the rules of the table d'hôte in many castles. The Great Hall also doubled as a legal court. The lord would hold sessions of justice from his chair at the high table, hearing disputes. Between tenants, delivering sentences and arbitrating land conflicts. On these occasions, the festive tone vanished entirely. The same space that rang with music one night could echo with sobs or silence the next. And those who stood before. The high table did so with trembling knees. Justice in the medieval period was rarely gentle. And being judged in front of an assembled audience, beneath the stern gaze of one's lord, was an ordeal designed to remind everyone that power, like the table, flowed only in one direction downhill. The hall also hosted ceremonies, knightings, marriages, presentations of gifts, and declarations of war. Each had its own ritual. A knight might kneel on the floor, sword held before him, while the lord recited an oath. A visiting noble might present a rare tapestry, carefully unrolled before the assembled company, as part of a negotiation. And every act was witnessed, commented on, and recorded, sometimes in memory, sometimes in writing. What happened in the Great Hall didn't stay in the Great Hall. It became the castle's oral history. Its rumor mill and its moral compass, even the design of the hall, was strategic. Fireplaces were placed to create warmth near the high table. Windows were set high to let in light without offering easy entry for attackers. Balconies and minstrels' galleries allowed entertainment to be provided from above, literally and symbolically. Everything pointed toward the idea of the hall as a carefully controlled environment. And everything within it, food, music, conversation, silence, served to elevate the host. The few times when the Great Hall did tilt toward revelry, usually during feast days like Christmas, Easter, or a lord's birthday, there were still rules. Carols were sung, jesters might perform, and extra courses of food were presented with ceremony. But even then, the fun was formal. Dances were choreographed. Songs had set verses. Laughter, while more frequent, was still carefully modulated. Any guest who became too merry, too loud, or too familiar could find themselves banished from the festivities, or worse, from the castle altogether. One particularly telling rule of the Great Hall was that even sleep had a hierarchy. In poorer or more crowded castles, the hall might serve as sleeping quarters for guards, retainers, or lower-ranking guests. But who got to sleep near the hearth? Who was given a blanket? Who was woken first in the morning? All these choices reflected their standing. Even unconscious bodies became part of the social map. Woe betide the man who laid his head too close to a noble's place and was discovered there come morning. The decorations of the Great Hall also reinforced its purpose. Shields and crests often hung on the walls, each representing lineage, alliance, or conquest. These were not random trophies. They were silent reminders of the Lord's power, his history, and the guests who owed him fealty. A visiting knight dining beneath the crest of a rival house might feel tension, even hostility. And that tension was intentional. The hall was not just a place to eat. It was a place to be seen, tested, and remembered dot to the noble family. The Great Hall was their theater. They played the roles of benefactors, rulers, judges, and hosts. Every meal was a performance. Every gesture carried weight. When the Lord offered a toast, it was more than politeness, it was a signal. When he chose to speak to one guest and not another, it shaped alliances. and when he remained silent, it sent a message louder than any command. The hall amplified his authority as surely as stone amplifies sound to the common servant. The hall was a stage where one never got a speaking role. You might spend hours setting the tables, pouring wine, lighting torches, and sweeping rushes, but you would never taste the roasted boar or sip the imported wine. You would be expected to move like mist, efficient, silent, and entirely forgettable. And if you were noticed, it was almost never good, and to the guest, not noble, but noble enough to be invited. The great hall was a minefield of etiquette. Where to sit, when to speak, how to compliment the food without overstepping, how to decline a dish without seeming rude. These were not casual decisions. A single misstep could cost you future invitations, or worse, the Lord's favor so, while the great hall may have been filled with music, food, and conversation. It was not a place for freedom. It was a place of watchfulness, of unspoken tension, of hierarchy dressed up in celebration. And for most, it was a place to be endured, not enjoyed, unless, of course, you were the one sitting at the high table. Then, and only then, was the great. All yours. If you were lucky enough to have a bed in a medieval castle, you might have thought you'd reached a level of comfort rare in the outside world. After all, most peasants in the countryside slept on straw piles with livestock nearby, or huddled beside hearths for warmth. So, a real bed in a real castle one, with walls, a door, and perhaps even a curtain might sound luxurious. But castle. Bedrooms were not places of privacy, peace, or pristine conditions. They were shared, noisy, cold, and deeply rooted in the social expectations of the time. To live in a castle was to give up the idea that you ever had a space entirely to yourself. Let's begin with the basic layout. Castles were not built with comfort in mind. They were designed for defense, function, and hierarchy. Rooms were small by modern standards, and those that passed for bedrooms were often multi-purpose. You might sleep in one corner and conduct meetings or prayers in the same space during the day. Even noble families lived in this kind of rotating arrangement, where one room had to serve a dozen purposes, none of them purely restful. The lord and lady had the best rooms, of course. Their chambers were typically located in the upper stories of the keep or tower, partly for security and partly to symbolically elevate them above everyone else. These rooms were larger than most, with wooden floors if you were fortunate, stone, walls hung with tapestries to keep out the cold, and beds with canopies or curtains to block drafts. But even these chambers were not private by modern definitions. Servants came and went constantly. You might be awakened by a squire in to stoke the fire, or a maid arriving to collect laundry, or a steward barging in to deliver news. The idea of knocking didn't really exist, especially not if you were of lower rank. The room was the lord's, yes, but it was also an office, a reception hall, and occasionally a sick room for recovering retainers, and the bed itself. Not exactly a pillow-top mattress. A noble's bed might have a feather or straw-stuffed mattress laid atop a wooden frame with ropes or wooden slats to support it. These ropes had to be tightened regularly, giving us the phrase, sleep tight. The bedding included wool blankets, linen sheets, if you could afford them, and animal furs in winter. But pests were a constant problem. Fleas, lice, and even bedbugs found their way into the seams. And without regular washing difficult in a time before plumbing cleanliness was relative as for everyone else. This situation worsened rapidly as you moved down the social ladder. Household knights or stewards might have small adjoining chambers, shared with one or two others. These rooms were often sparsely furnished, just a bed or two, a chest, and perhaps a stool. Fireplaces were rare, so warmth came from layering, not heating. The floors were sometimes stone, sometimes packed earth, and sleeping meant enduring the cold, the damp, and the sound of castle life grinding on at all hours. Servants, on the other hand, often didn't have bedrooms at all. Many slept where? They worked on floors near the kitchens, in alcoves off the great hall, or tucked under staircases. They might be given straw pallets or share beds with one another. This practice, known as hot bedding, allowed servants working different shifts to sleep in the same bed at different times of day. Hygiene was minimal. Bedding might be aired out once a week, if that. And in an era without soap-based detergents, sheets were rarely cleaned to modern standards. Privacy was almost non-existent. The castle was a communal space, and its bedrooms reflected this. If you were of rank, you might have curtains around your bed, but those were to keep out the cold more than wandering eyes. Most people dressed, undressed, slept, and sometimes even relieved themselves within the same shared spaces. Chamber pots were used during the night, small ceramic or metal containers tucked under the bed. Emptying them was someone's job. Smelling them was everyone's burden. And then there was the noise. Castles echoed. Stone walls carried sound in surprising ways. A conversation in the hallway could be heard 3 rooms away. A door closing reverberated like a drumbeat. Snoring, coughing, whispered prayers. These were the lullabies of castle life. And during feasts, the noise from the great hall could rise to a dull roar, filtering up through the cracks in the floorboards or down stairwells into the servants' quarters. There were no quiet hours, only quieter moments. Children, especially, noble ones, often slept in the same chambers as their parents or attendants. Young pages and squires were expected to share space with one another or sleep near their assigned nights. These arrangements weren't just practical. They reinforced hierarchy. Proximity to a lord or lady was a sign of favor, and to be assigned. To sleep near them, especially in their outer chambers, was a mark of trust. But it also meant constant vigilance. If your lord stirred in the night and called for wine or assistance, you were expected to wake immediately, without complaint. Female servants and ladies in waiting had similarly communal arrangements. A lady of high rank might have her own bedchamber, but she would be surrounded at night by maids or companions, who were expected to sleep in the same room or in a curtained-off alcove. Intimacy, secrecy, and solitude were foreign concepts in the medieval world. Your body was always in company. Your actions always noted. In winter, the problem of heat made everything worse. With no central heating and thick stone walls that trapped cold air, bedrooms became icy chambers. Fires were reserved for the highest-ranking people, and even then, the warmth rarely extended beyond a few feet. Blankets were piled thick, and people sometimes slept in their clothes. In the coldest castles, it was not unusual to wake up with frost on your bedding. The cold encouraged closeness, and so sharing beds, even among people who might otherwise not speak, was common. Warmth, like privacy, was a communal resource. There were also cultural rules about where you could sleep and with whom. Marriage, social class, and gender all played roles in assigning sleeping arrangements. A visiting nobleman might be given a guest chamber, but not always one to himself. He might share with a cousin or attendant. Likewise, lower-ranking guests might be placed on pallets in the solar, or the Great Hall itself. It wasn't uncommon for people to sleep in shifts. In times of war or unrest, guards and soldiers took turns resting in cramped chambers, ever ready to spring into action. In some cases, even noble children would sleep on benches or in corners until their status demanded more formal arrangements. Cleanliness was a constant challenge. Without indoor plumbing, water had to be carried in by hand, often from an outdoor well or cistern. Washing bedding required enormous effort, and many items were only cleaned a few times per year. People aired their sheets and clothes in the sun, sprinkled beds with herbs to mask smells, and burned incense or used rushes to freshen the air. But these were temporary measures. The truth was, a castle bedroom, no matter how finely appointed, was a place of lingering smells, tired bodies, and routine discomfort. And then there were the bugs. Fleas and lice were not merely annoyances. They were part of life. Combs were shared, bedding was reused, and infestations were common. Medieval people had no concept of germ theory, but they understood enough to know that filth brought sickness. So they layered perfumes, used scented pillows, and scattered lavender or rosemary on their beds. But these were cover-ups, not cures. It's also worth noting that bedrooms weren't always used just for sleeping. In the medieval worldview, a bed was also a symbol of status, a place to give birth, a site for recovery, and significantly a setting for receiving visitors. It was not unusual for nobles to hold conversations, receive clergy, or conduct business while reclining in bed. Guests might be offered a seat on the edge of the mattress or a nearby stool. The bedroom, in this sense, was a kind of throne room in miniature. In castles under siege, the notion of bedroom comfort evaporated entirely. Families might retreat to the upper rooms of the keep, packed together with servants and supplies. Bedding was makeshift, and sleep came in fits. Moats froze, fires burned low, and disease spread fast. In such times, even the lord's own chamber lost its dignity and became little more than a cramped bunker with nice drapes. Ultimately, the bedroom in a medieval castle was not a retreat from the world. It was part of it. You were never alone. You were rarely clean. You were always watched, expected, required. Every bed had a hierarchy. Every chamber had a purpose beyond rest. And every night you slept not in silence, but in the crowded, restless hum of castle life. Till the next time. You imagine drifting off to sleep in a grand canopy bed beneath the stone arches of a medieval chamber. Remember, the bed creaks, the straw itches, someone is coughing 2 feet away, and there's a cold draft slicing through your blanket. Because in the medieval castle, even sleep obeyed the rules, and privacy was the one luxury no one could afford. The towering grandeur of a medieval castle might dazzle visitors at first. Those massive stone walls, lofty turrets, and echoing great halls all suggested order and permanence. But within that solid and seemingly noble shell lay one of the most unpleasant truths of medieval life: the complete and utter lack of comfortable, private, or even halfway hygienic bathroom arrangements. There were no flushing toilets, no plumbing, and very little dignity in the act of relieving oneself. If you lived in a medieval castle, your bodily needs were everyone's business, and they had rules, rituals, and consequences to start. Castles did have toilets of a kind, and they even had a name: the garderobe. A word that has traveled a long way from its roots. It now refers to a wardrobe or closet, but originally it meant the castle's designated toilet room. The garderobe was often just a small stone chamber built into the wall, sometimes projecting out slightly from the side of the castle. At the bottom of this narrow shaft or opening was a straight drop into a pit, moat, or open cesspool below. In theory, gravity took care of waste. In practice, it often just piled up. Many garderobes were shared. In some larger castles, there might be multiple garderobes stacked vertically along a tower wall, each opening into the same vertical chute. The smell traveled upward, not downward. So if you were using the upper garderobe, you were at least safer than the person below you, who might be contending with the lingering scent, or worse, the occasional surprise from above. The term garderobe itself hints at the medieval idea of combining functions. The space was sometimes also used to store clothing, with the belief that the strong stench would deter lice and moths. Access to these toilet spaces was not equal. The lord and lady might have a private garderobe attached to their chamber or solar, giving them the luxury of solitude and slightly less public embarrassment. These higher-ranking garderobes might be cleaned more frequently, or at least less neglected. But for everyone else, there were strict rules. You waited your turn. You didn't linger. You never used the lord's facilities without permission. And you certainly didn't complain about the smell, because everyone else had to deal with it. Now, if a garderobe wasn't nearby, or if you were a servant who wasn't allowed to leave your post, you used a chamber pot. These were ceramic or metal bowls with wide rims and were kept under beds, behind curtains, or beneath benches. At night, especially in the freezing winters, no one wanted to trek down a spiral staircase to a freezing stone tower just to relieve themselves. So chamber pots were the solution. Convenient, yes, but far from sanitary. Their contents were emptied by hand. If you were a lower servant, this task might fall to you. You carried the pot outside, downstairs, and dumped it in a cesspit or open trench. Spillage was common, so were accidents in more crowded parts of the castle. Servants sometimes dumped waste out of windows or over parapets, ideally into designated areas. But ideally didn't always align with reality. Visitors walking below had to watch their step. One wrong turn, and you might find yourself in the direct line of something far worse than rain. The term garde as l'eau, French for watch out for the water, was shouted before tossing waste from windows, and over time that phrase slurred into the English word loo. Linguistic evolution born of shared misery, but the real discomfort wasn't just in the act, it was in the social etiquette surrounding it. You were not supposed to talk openly about your needs. Bodily functions were acknowledged with euphemism, gesture, or just grim resignation. If a noble had to excuse themselves during a meal, it was done with silence. A servant might follow discreetly with a candle or cloth, waiting outside the chamber with lowered eyes, and returning too quickly or taking too long could earn whispers, jokes, or worse, suspicion. Cleanliness was, by modern standards, tragically limited. There was no toilet paper. In some regions, moss, straw, or rags were used instead. In wealthier households, bits of cloth might be set aside for personal use and then washed, though washed didn't always mean clean. Some castles kept water jugs or basins near garderobes for rinsing, but in winter, those might be frozen solid. And soap, made of animal fat and ash, was expensive and harsh. Most people cleaned themselves with cold water and a prayer. These grim realities, bathroom use had rules and customs that were tightly woven into the fabric of life. A guest in the castle would never ask where the toilet was directly. They would ask to be shown to a private place or to be alone for a moment. The reply would be similarly vague. If you had a servant, they were expected to know your schedule, your preferences, and your needs. If you didn't have one, you were expected to manage discreetly in winter. The situation grew more dire. Stone walls retained the cold, and the act of relieving oneself became physically painful. Some garderobes were lined with wooden seats to prevent skin from sticking to freezing stone, but most were not. Long robes helped retain warmth, but also made maneuvering awkward. The constant battle between modesty and necessity defined the entire experience. Then there were the risks. Garderobes and waste pits attracted vermin rats, insects, and flies. Falling into a latrine was not just a possibility. It was a known danger. There are records of individuals, some even of noble birth, who fell into cesspools and died, either from drowning or the infection that followed. The filth was not just disgusting, it was deadly. Disease spread quickly in and around these pits. Dysentery, typhoid, and cholera didn't care if you were a lord or a peasant. And in the close quarters of a castle, sickness could move like wildfire. Waste management was an ongoing challenge. Some castles employed gong farmers, laborers tasked with cleaning out cesspits and waste trenches. These men worked at night, often alone, and were paid surprisingly well given the horrific nature of the job. Their work was essential. Without them, the castle would become unlivable. Yet they were also shunned. No one wanted to dine near the man who spent his night knee-deep in sewage. And so, like so many vital roles in castle life, their presence was tolerated, but never embraced. Etiquette also dictated silence. You did not comment on someone's smell. You didn't speak of noises from behind closed doors. If a chamber pot spilled in a hallway, you stepped over it in silence. The only people who were allowed to address these things directly were the ones paid to clean them up. And even they rarely spoke about it outside their own circles. For women, the challenges were even greater. Clothing was layered and cumbersome, making the act of undressing to use a chamber pot or garderobe both time-consuming and frustrating. There were no designated female restrooms, just different times or locations. Some women had attendants to help them, but many did not. And the fear of exposure, embarrassment, or being caught in an awkward moment was constant. Privacy was a luxury they almost never had. Despite all of this, the people who lived in castles accepted these inconveniences as normal. The stone floors, the stench, the shared pots, it was all part of life. Complaining about it would mark you as spoiled or weak. Jokes were made in private, especially among servants, but open criticism was rare. and any attempts at improvement, better latrines, cleaner water, scheduled cleaning depended entirely on the Lord's priorities and wealth. If he didn't care, nothing changed. There were occasional innovations. Some castles experimented with running water, channeling streams to wash away waste. Others developed more sophisticated drainage systems, using gravity and cleverly angled chutes. But these were rare, expensive, and prone to failure. More often, castles simply let the filth accumulate until it couldn't be ignored. At which point, someone, usually a servant, was told to deal with it. And so, in the end, the bathroom rules of castle life came down to this: act as though nothing is happening, even when it very much is. Use what's available. Don't overstay your time in the garderobe. Empty your pot promptly, and never ask questions about anyone else's. Avoid the lower garderobes if you can. Walk wide beneath open windows. Keep a cloth with you if the wind is wrong. And above all, remember that in a place built for knights and nobles, waste had no class boundaries. It stank just the same for everyone. So, while a medieval castle may have looked like a monument to power and order, behind every great hall was a freezing garderobe dripping with filth, and under every velvet canopy lay a chamber pot brimming with the evidence of a life that, in truth, was far from elegant. The bathroom rules weren't just rules, they were survival when night fell. Over a medieval castle, it didn't bring the silence you might imagine. There were no humming refrigerators, no electrical buzz, no traffic beyond the walls, but that doesn't mean it was quiet. In fact, the night inside a castle was often its own kind of chaos. The rule of quiet, the expectation that nights were. For rest and peace was one of those polite fictions that no one truly followed. Between the stone walls, cramped quarters, and the overlapping lives of dozens or even hundreds of residents, the castle at night was a living, groaning, often maddening organism. The day didn't end at sunset. That was just when things shifted. Torches were lit, hearths were stoked, and the night watch took over. In a well-staffed castle, guards patrolled corridors and walls in rotating shifts. Their footsteps echoed off the flagstone floors, boots clicking or scuffing against old mortar. Every hour they passed each other, and sometimes exchanged brief words or a quiet nod. Occasionally, they'd knock on a chamber door to confirm all was well, and when someone was missing, when a door was ajar, everyone was roused in a hurry. Then there was the sound of the servants. The lower staff didn't get to rest just because the sun was down. In fact, nighttime was often when they were busiest. The castle kitchens had to be cleaned and restocked. Embers had to be maintained to make relighting easier in the morning. Floors were swept, bed linen shaken out, chamber pots emptied. Laundry might be rinsed at night and hung in enclosed areas. You could hear water sloshing in buckets, wooden sawhorses tapping as they moved from room to room, and the occasional dropped object followed by a sharp hiss or a muttered curse, even those trying. To be quiet made noise on stone floors. The architecture of castles didn't help. Thick stone walls didn't insulate sound, they amplified it. Sound didn't pass easily through stone, but it did bounce and carry through corridors, spiral staircases, and great halls like a drum. A conversation in one tower might not travel into the next room, but a dropped spoon in the main hall could be heard 3 floors above. The echo of metal on stone became a permanent feature of castle life, a strange kind of background music. And at night, without the busyness of daily activity to drown it out, every creak, every cough, every clatter was painfully obvious. Then there were the animals. Many castles kept dogs, especially for hunting or security. These dogs roamed freely. At night and barked at anything unfamiliar. A wind-blown shutter, a servant hurrying to the garderobe, a distant owl. Cats, too, kept for pest control, would meow, hiss, or knock things over while chasing rodents. Horses in the stables could be heard shifting, snorting, or pawing the ground. Chickens roosting in the bailey or pigs penned outside made their own contributions. A castle wasn't just home to people, it was a barnyard with walls. And of course there were the people. In a castle with limited bedrooms and overflowing ranks, many slept communally. Guards shared bunks. Servants curled up in corners or next to fires. Pages and squires packed into small chambers off the halls. All of them breathed, coughed, muttered, and snored. Snoring was not just common, it was legendary. Stories survive of noblemen whose thunderous sleep sounds could be heard through walls. Some poor soul might be assigned to sleep nearby, tasked with waking the man at dawn, forced to endure the nightly rumble. Illness added another layer. With no modern medicine and poor sanitation, colds, fevers, and infections were constant companions. A sick child whimpered through the night. A soldier with a wounded leg groaned in pain. A servant with a cough kept half the corridor awake. And when outbreaks occurred, typhoid, dysentery, plague, entire wings of the castle became night wards, echoing with the sounds of suffering. Moans, retching, whispered prayers, and weeping filled the silence more than any peaceful snore ever could. Even the nobility weren't spared. Their beds might be softer and their fireplaces larger, but their nights were still filled with disturbances. Servants crept in to tend the fire or remove chamber pots. Messengers arrived late from distant villages or noble allies, demanding attention at once. A child might cry out from a nearby room, or a visiting guest might knock seeking comfort or conversation. The Lord's chamber, meant to be a sanctuary, was more like a reception hall with linens, and let's not forget the political intrigue. Castles were centers of power, and power rarely sleeps peacefully. Nighttime meetings were not uncommon. A steward might be summoned to review a letter. A priest might be called to hear a confession. A knight might sneak off for a romantic tryst or a whispered argument. Doors creaked open in the dark, steps echoed in hallways, and voices murmured just out of earshot. Secrets moved best under the cover of night, and the castle was always listening. Seasons added their own complications. In winter, wind howled through the cracks and shutters and doors. Chimneys moaned like ghosts. Ice cracked on windowsills and roof tiles, shifted under. Snow. In spring, rain hammered the roof and splashed against stone. Water pooled in low corridors. In summer, insects buzzed, and open windows admitted every hoot, chirp, or flutter from the outside. Autumn brought the rustle of dry leaves and the scrape of branches against tower walls. The castle never slept because nature never did, and the very rules meant to enforce quiet only highlighted how impossible it was. In theory, castle life had rhythms, bells for prayers, silence after curfew, assigned sleeping hours. But in practice, the urgency of survival, duty, and proximity made true silence rare. A servant might be punished for speaking after dark, but still be required to report a fire, or a broken door or a guest's sudden illness. Guards might be told to patrol quietly, but had to raise the alarm if danger approached. And so noise crept in, justified and unavoidable. Even entertainment didn't always stop with the sun. After special feasts or holy days, guests might linger into the night. Minstrels played softer tunes, drunk nobles sang off-key in corridors, and dancers stumbled between rooms. Candles guttered in their holders, casting flickering shadows. Laughter echoed, but so did the sharp whisper of rebuke from someone trying to sleep. A castle's joy could be as loud as its sorrow in many ways. Sleep in a castle was an exercise in patience and resignation. You didn't expect quiet, you hoped for it. You accepted that you might be awakened 3 or 4 times a night, and you learned to fall asleep quickly in between. People slept in shifts. Some went to bed after sunset and rose before dawn. Others napped midday in sunlit corners. The concept of a full 8 hours was laughable. You took what rest you could, when you could, wherever you could, and then there was fear. The castle might be peaceful now, but what about tomorrow? What if the enemy returned? What if the plague crept in with a traveler? What if a noble's death sparked a power struggle? Fear hung heavy at night. And fear has its own sound, the quickening breath. The creak of someone checking the lock again. The whispered prayers offered not for peace, but for survival. And so, despite the rule of quiet, a polite illusion maintained. By those at the top, the night inside a medieval castle was alive with noise. Some of it mundane, some of it tragic, some of it strangely comforting. It was the sound of life in all its mésanges, restless, watchful, layered, and loud. The castle never truly slept, and neither did the people inside it, if you imagine that. Waking up in a medieval castle involved a soft stretch, a warm blanket, and birdsong outside the window. You're in for a rude awakening, quite literally. Rising in the morning in a medieval castle was often abrupt, cold, and inconvenient. The sounds of roosters crowing or bells ringing weren't quaint. They were signals that your day was about to begin, whether you were ready or not. And in a structure built for utility and hierarchy, the morning routine was less about personal comfort and more about preparing to function in a system where every minute counted. The first and perhaps most unavoidable feature of a castle morning was the cold. Castles were made of stone, and stone holds onto the chill of night like a miser clutches coins. Even with a fire burning low in the hearth, most rooms were icy by dawn. Blankets, if you had them, were often heavy, damp from humidity, and only marginally effective. Many people slept in their clothes, not from laziness but necessity. Getting out of bed meant facing not only the day's responsibilities, but the numbing cold of a world that had no insulation. No central heating and no gentle transition from night to day. There were no alarm clocks, of course, but there were servants. If you were a person of rank, your wake-up call came not from the sun, but from a knock at your door or the soft clatter of a servant entering with a basin of water. That basin was rarely warm. Most of the time, it had been drawn from a well or cistern, and unless someone had thought ahead to leave it near a hearth overnight, you were washing your face with near-freezing water. Nobles might have the luxury of warmed water on feast days or during illnesses, but most days, you took what you got. Servants, on the other hand, didn't need to be woken up. They were expected to already be moving before the rest of the castle stirred. Their morning started in darkness, long before the rooster crowed. Kitchens had to be swept, fires stoked, bread begun. Chamber pots had to be emptied, beds remade, and clothing laid out. If you were a scullion, you might spend your first hour just dragging firewood through a series of dark, narrow corridors to reach all the hearths. If you were a chambermaid, you had to move quickly and quietly, navigating through sleeping bodies, groggy nobles, and creaky floors. You didn't want to wake the wrong person at the wrong time. That mistake could cost you your position, or worse, morning prayer was a regular feature of castle life, especially in Christian Europe where most castles had chapels or resident clergy. The first of the canonical hours, matins or lauds, was often held at or just before sunrise. Attending this wasn't optional for most people. Lords and ladies were expected to show piety, and household staff were often required to attend in shifts. The chapel, still cold and echoing in the early light, filled with mumbled Latin, rustling cloaks, and the scent of last night's rushers. This wasn't spiritual rejuvenation. It was ritual. And for many, it was just another task before. Breakfast, speaking of breakfast, that meal looked very different from modern expectations. The concept of 3 square meals a day hadn't been standardized yet. For laborers and servants, breakfast might consist of coarse bread, ale, and maybe a bit of cheese eaten standing up or on the move. Nobles sometimes waited until mid-morning for their first real meal, a tradition stemming from monastic routines where eating early was considered indulgent. When they did eat, it might be a light meal, some pottage, a soft-boiled egg, or slices of cured meat. There was no coffee, no eggs Benedict, no lingering over a table with sunlight pouring in. Meals were fuel, taken quickly and without fanfare. Dressing was another complicated and often public affair. A lord or lady didn't usually dress themselves entirely. Servants assisted, bringing layers of undergarments, hose, tunics, and cloaks. Shoes had to be fetched, belts fastened, jewelry chosen if appropriate. Each piece had to be inspected for cleanliness and condition. If something was missing or wrinkled or worse, still damp from the last wash, the blame fell squarely on the servant who managed that task. This meant that mornings were not just stressful for the person being dressed, but even more so for those doing the dressing. For lower-ranking castle dwellers, dressing meant shaking the mice out of your shoes, checking for fleas in your linens, and hoping your single pair of breeches wasn't too stiff with sweat or mud from the day before. Clean clothes weren't guaranteed, and many people wore the same set for days or weeks, simply changing outer layers or patching holes as needed. Children especially were dressed quickly and sent to their duties, whether helping in the kitchens, running messages, or beginning their training as pages or maids in waiting. Once everyone was awake, the castle buzzed like a hive. Orders had to be given, supplies fetched, animals fed, and maintenance started. Stone didn't take care of itself. Roofs leaked. Fires needed tending. Drawbridges were tested. And floors strewn with straw or rushes to soak up the filth of daily life had to be swept or changed out entirely. All of this happened as the castle's inhabitants rubbed sleep from their eyes and tried to remember what they were supposed to do that day. If you were a knight or a soldier, waking up meant checking your weapons, inspecting your armor, and perhaps beginning a morning drill. Practice yards filled with the sound of clashing wooden swords, shouting sergeants, and grumbling squires. Horses had to be readied and messengers prepared for travel. If the castle was expecting visitors or planning a hunt, these preparations could take hours, all coordinated from the moment the first person's eyes opened. And then there were the unwelcome surprises. Waking up to a messenger bearing bad news, a horse gone lame, a visiting noble arriving early, a servant missing, a child sick with fever, a kitchen fire, an unexpected hole in outer wall. Every morning brought the possibility of disaster. And because castles functioned as both homes and military outposts, mornings were often more about crisis management than calm routine. Cleanliness was also attempted, however inefficiently. Lords and ladies might wash their faces and hands in perfumed water, or use cloths soaked in vinegar or rosewater. Dental hygiene, such as it was, involved chewing herbs or wiping teeth with linen. Hair was brushed out or braided. And even these simple tasks required help from others. There were no toothbrushes, no mirrors on the wall, no moment of solitude to get yourself ready for the day. You were always being watched, helped, or hurried in rare moments, especially on feast days. Or after successful battles, mornings could be slow. A noble family might linger in bed, basking in a sense of security or pride. But even then, castle life didn't stop. Servants still worked, messages still arrived, and the fires still needed stoking. The illusion of peace was always temporary, and as the sun rose higher in the sky, the rhythms of the day reasserted themselves. The kitchens clattered. Hooves echoed in the courtyard. Gates opened. The steward made his rounds. The castle was awake fully now. The cold of morning gave way to the heat of labor. And for everyone inside, the day ahead promised not rest, but responsibility. So no, waking up in a medieval castle wasn't peaceful. It was noisy, uncomfortable, and often humbling. Whether you were a noble or a servant, a child or a knight, each dawn brought you face to face with your duties, your limitations, and the stiff breeze whistling through thee. Cracks in your windowless stone wall. Sleep was fleeting. Quiet was rare. Comfort was earned. And peace, if you ever found it, didn't come in the morning dot in a medieval castle. You didn't just live under a lord's roof. You lived under a strict, invisible architecture of hierarchy. Every word, gesture, seat, and bite of food had meaning. There were unspoken and often spoken rules about who could speak to whom, who could sit at which table, when you could eat, and what you could say while eating. It was a social order carved into the stone as deeply as any arch or doorway. The first and most important rule of castle life was this: you had a place, and you were expected to know it. If you forgot or dared to challenge it, others were more than happy to remind you. At the top was the lord or lady, rulers of the household, owners of the land, and the people to whom everyone else technically owed their presence. Even visiting nobility knew their status in relation to the castle's primary family. Beneath them came their children, noble guests, knights, chaplains, stewards, household officers, squires, pages, and Finally, servants. Each of these roles had subcategories. The difference between a personal valet and a stable boy could be enormous in daily experience. Everyone had a place, and everyone was expected to behave accordingly. This hierarchy shaped even basic interactions. Speaking was not a right, it was a privilege. You did not speak to your betters unless they spoke to you first. A servant might be in the same room as a nobleman every day and never exchange a single word unless delivering a message or receiving a direct order. Eye contact could be seen as insolent. A smile might be too familiar. And forget humor joking with a superior without being invited to do so could cost you your position, or worse. If you were of higher rank, on the other hand, your voice carried literal power. Nobles could command obedience with a single sentence. Their tone shaped how the entire household functioned. A stern word could send a steward into a flurry of corrections. A compliment could elevate a servant's status overnight. Words weren't. Casual, they were tools, weapons, and sometimes currency. Eating followed the same rigid structure. Meals in a medieval castle were highly choreographed affairs, not just about food, but about status. The lord and lady sat at the high table, typically elevated on a platform at one end of the great hall. Their backs were to the wall and they faced the room, a subtle but constant reminder of their supremacy. This wasn't about comfort. It was about visibility and dominance. Who sat near them mattered. Proximity to the high table signified favor or importance. A visiting bishop or noble might be given a place of honor. A favored knight might be invited closer. But for most residents, you sat at the lower tables, arranged according to your rank, duties, or recent behavior. Tables were often long wooden planks with benches on either side, and seating was assigned or understood. You didn't just plop down next to your friend. If your role was humble, you ate at the end of the hall, farthest from the fire, the light, and the best food. Yes, even the food was distributed hierarchically. While the lord and lady dined on the choicest cuts, rich stews, seasoned pies, and sweetmeats, the lower tables might get plain pottage, coarse bread, and whatever was left. Some kitchens made multiple versions of the same dish one seasoned, and presented for the high table, the other a diluted version for the servants. You were reminded of your place not only by where you sat, but by what was placed in front of you, and don't expect to eat when you want to. Meals were held at specific times and typically began with prayers. If you were a servant or lower-ranking household member, you might eat only after the Lord had finished, often in a separate room entirely. You had to wait for the signal, usually a bell or a call before beginning, and there were expectations. About behavior, talking during meals was permitted in some households, but only in moderation and never while chewing. Slouching was frowned upon. Elbows off the table, unless you were resting after carving meat. And always keep your hands visible. This wasn't just about manners, but about safety and trust in larger households. Food was sometimes distributed by senior servants or the steward himself, who oversaw not only what was served, but how it was received. Grumbling about your portion could get you reassigned or punished. On feast days or special occasions, the rules relaxed slightly, but even then, behavior was watched. You didn't drink too much, laugh too loud, or forget to acknowledge the host. If you were a guest, failing to praise the food or express gratitude could mark you as rude or ungrateful. Even sitting had rules. Certain benches or chairs were reserved for particular individuals. The Lord's seat was often larger, higher backed, and sometimes even carved with family symbols. No one sat in it unless explicitly told to do so. If the chair was empty, it stayed empty. Sitting in the wrong place wasn't just a faux pas, it was a challenge to authority. And for a servant, sitting at all while on duty was risky. Most stood at attention during meals, ready to refill cups, fetch platters, or clean spills. Rest was something you earned when everyone else was comfortable. These dynamics weren't confined to mealtimes. Throughout the castle, your rank determined everything from when you bathed, if at all, to which corridors you could use, to whether you could warm your hands at a particular hearth. Some rooms were entirely off limits to lower ranks. Others could only be entered under supervision. A steward might have a master key, but a scullion might not even be allowed on certain floors. The idea was not just to maintain order, but to reinforce identity. You weren't just a person, you were a role, a station. Even conversations were filtered through hierarchy. Gossip among servants happened behind closed doors or in quiet corners. An overheard remark could be dangerous. If a noblewoman's maid whispered something about her mistress's behavior, and it reached the wrong ears, both the maid and anyone she spoke to could face discipline. Loyalty was not just encouraged, it was enforced. And betrayal of that loyalty could mean expulsion or, in extreme cases, physical punishment. This rigid structure had its benefits for those at the top. It created predictability, reduced internal conflict, at least on the surface, and gave a clear sense of who was responsible for what, but it also bred resentment. Servants learned to smile and obey even when tired, insulted, or mistreated. Lower-ranking knights endured cold meals and lower pay for years, hoping for promotion. And women, even noble ones, were constantly navigating an additional layer of expectation. Deference not just to rank, but to gender norms that dictated obedience, modesty, and silence. There were occasional breaches in the system, of course. A favored servant might be invited to dine in the Lord's presence. A noble might marry below their station. A clever steward might amass enough influence to be treated as an equal by his social superiors. But these were exceptions that proved the rule. For most people, daily life in the castle meant performing your status over and over again through gestures, posture, tone, even silence. And the most important thing, everyone was watching. Your behavior was constantly observed by others, superiors, equals, subordinates. Step out of line, and someone would notice. Praise could elevate you. Scorn could bury you. It was a world in which everyone's place was measured by distance from the high table, from the Lord's chambers, from the warmth of the central hearth. And even if you served your whole life faithfully, that distance might never change. So living in a medieval castle wasn't just about surviving the cold or the food or the lack of privacy. It was about learning to inhabit a role that was never truly your own. It was about mastering this subtle choreography of power, knowing when to speak, when to listen, when to stand, and where to sit. It was a world of rules, and those rules didn't just govern the castle, they were the castle. Love in a medieval castle was rarely about moonlit serenades or spontaneous embraces. It was about alliances, lineage, and obligations. The romanticized visions of chivalrous knights pining for noble ladies or secret affairs in tower chambers might have some basis in poetry. But for most of the people actually living within those stone walls, romance was a deeply structured, rule-bound affair. The heart may have wanted what it wanted, but the castle, with its rigid hierarchy and social expectations, had other plans to begin. Marriage wasn't primarily about affection. It was a contract one that concerned wealth, land, bloodlines, and political advantage. For noble families, arranging a marriage was often a months-long, sometimes years-long process involving negotiations between fathers, uncles, lords, or kings. A marriage could strengthen alliances between rival houses, secure control over a disputed estate, or tie one family to another's rising star. A lord didn't just marry for love. He married for land, dowry, and lineage. The dowry was a key part of this arrangement. When a woman was married off, her family typically provided a sum of money, goods, livestock, or even land to the husband's family as part of the deal. This wasn't just generosity, it was compensation for the woman's future role as caretaker, childbearer, and status symbol. The larger the dowry, the better the match. For wealthier families, dowries could be immense. For lesser nobles, the lack of a dowry might mean a daughter entered a convent instead. Women had little say in these arrangements. A noble woman might be betrothed as a child and married off in her early teens. The church technically set the age of consent for girls at 12, though actual consummation was often delayed until they were older. Still, It wasn't unheard of for very young women to be married off and deals sealed when they were barely out of the nursery. Their opinion on the match was not required. Their role was to serve the family. Men also had obligations, though, with more agency. A young lord or knight might also be betrothed early, but he had more options. He might refuse a match, delay it, or use his rising status to negotiate a better one. That said, he too was expected to marry for strategic reasons. And romantic affection was usually secondary, if considered at all. A knight's love, if it existed, was often directed outside of marriage, in courtly pursuits, in affairs, or in dangerous liaisons with women far below his station, which brings us to courtly love, a strange and structured form of pseudo-romance that flourished among the nobility, especially in France and England during the High Middle Ages. Courtly love was essentially ritualized flirtation, governed by unwritten, and sometimes written, codes. A knight might pledge himself to a lady, often one who was already married, devote his deeds to her honor. He might write poetry, fight in her name, wear her token in battle. These affections were often unconsummated, existing more in the realm of performance and aspiration than actual intimacy. Why did it exist? Partly because noble marriages were transactional, and partly because castle life was deeply repressive. Everyone lived under a web of rules and expectations, and courtly love offered a sanctioned outlet for longing, emotion, and ego. But it was not without consequences. Real affairs, especially those that cross social boundaries, could lead to scandal, punishment, or exile. A nobleman caught with a lady of the court might lose his standing. A servant caught in a noblewoman's bed could be executed. Gender roles were rigid and defined from birth. Noble women were expected to be obedient, modest, pious, and fertile. Their primary value was their ability to marry well and produce healthy heirs, preferably male. They might oversee the domestic side of castle life, managing the household, and servants, but their power was always secondhand, derived from the status of their husband or father. Men were expected to be providers, protectors, and rulers. A man's ability to fight, command, and administer land determined his worth. Masculinity was tied to honor and dominance, both on the battlefield and in the home. A man who failed to control his wife or daughters was mocked. A man who let love cloud his judgment might be whispered about in corridors. Even romantic feeling had to be performed within strict boundaries, and yet love still found its way in. People did fall for each other awkwardly, painfully, sometimes tragically. A page might fall for a lady he couldn't approach. A maid might pine for a knight who barely noticed her. A marriage arranged for land might, over years, turn into mutual respect, even affection. These stories rarely made it into the official records, but they existed, hidden in letters, folk songs, or the wistful stories passed down in quiet corners for the lower classes within the castle, the servants, the cooks. The groom's marriage was less political but still controlled. Servants typically had to seek permission to marry, especially if their roles would be affected. A married maid might be dismissed. A cook who wed the stable master might be seen as consolidating too much informal power in the kitchen yard. These relationships were carefully watched. Pregnancies out of wedlock could lead to expulsion, or worse. Bastardy was heavily stigmatized, and the church had little mercy for loose women, especially if they had no means of support. Punishments for breaking romantic rules varied. A noble woman caught in adultery might be sent to a convent or quietly confined. A man might be challenged to a duel or, if politically inconvenient, banished. Lower class offenders were treated more harshly. A pregnant maid might be whipped, dismissed, or made to stand in the pillory. In some cases, especially where a noble's honor was involved, violence followed. Castle life was a small world, and when reputations fell, they fell fast. Despite this, human beings are endlessly inventive. Secret signals, nighttime meetings, and coded messages thrived in castle corridors. Lovers met under staircases, left notes in linen chests, cast glances during mass. Gossip flourished. And with every new arrival, whether a visiting knight, a merchant's son, or a young widow hearts, stirred, rules were bent, and risks were taken. The church loomed large over all of this. As the moral authority of the age, it dictated what was and wasn't acceptable in love and marriage. Marriage was a sacrament, not just a legal contract, and breaking its sanctity had eternal consequences. Adultery, fornication, even lustful thoughts were sins. Priests heard confessions, offered penance, and occasionally blackmailed those whose secrets were too juicy to keep to themselves. But the church also served as refuge. Unwanted marriages were occasionally annulled. Lovers fled to abbeys for protection. And not all clergy were immune to temptation. They too played roles in the castle's romantic dramas, often behind closed doors. Same-sex relationships, while not openly acknowledged, did exist. Records are sparse and often coded, but there are glimpses, letters between knights that suggest deep emotional bonds. Accusations of sodomy used to discredit rivals, and religious tracts warning against unnatural affections. In such a rigid, hierarchical world, any deviation from the norm was dangerous, but that didn't stop people from feeling or acting on what the heart desired. Ultimately, love in a medieval castle was a negotiation between desire and duty, between tradition and impulse, between the rules written in stone and the feelings that ignored them. Marriage was a transaction, gender a cage, and romance a game best played quietly. And yet, despite all the rules, perhaps because of them, love remained a potent force. It whispered through keyholes, tiptoed across stone floors, and lingered in the spaces where eyes met, but words could not follow. Growing up in a medieval castle might sound like a fantasy, a life of velvet clothes, grand halls, and adventure around every stone corner. But for the children who actually lived there, the reality was far more serious, structured, and in many ways unsettling. Whether born into nobility or raised among the servant class, children in castles weren't coddled. They were expected to grow into their role quickly, and without questioning the system that awaited them. The moment a child was born in a castle, their future was essentially scripted. If you were a noble child, you had a destiny to fulfill. Your birth wasn't just a personal or family event, it was a political one. A boy might be the heir to land, title, or even power over other families. A girl might represent the family's future alliances through marriage. Midwives, nurses, and wet nurses handled the earliest care, while the parents, especially noble fathers, remained somewhat detached. Affection was not absent, but duty was stronger than sentiment. Infant mortality was tragically common, even in castles. Disease, infection, and accidents were constant threats. Castles were cold, damp, and filled with people, and that meant germs. Babies were swaddled tightly in cloths to keep them warm and restrict movement, based on the belief that this would help their limbs grow straight. Feeding was often handled by wet nurses, women hired or kept in the household specifically to nurse noble infants, sometimes even while caring for their own children. A high-ranking woman was not expected to breastfeed unless absolutely necessary. As soon as children could walk and talk, expectations kicked in. There was no prolonged childhood. As we know it today, no long years of play, no assumption of innocence. Children were mini adults in training, and the castle was their classroom. Little boys of noble blood might begin their training as pages by the age of 7. Girls were trained to manage a household, observe the duties of a lady, and above all, learn obedience and grace. Their toys, if any, were wooden swords, hobby horses, or dolls, all echoing the roles they were meant to grow into. A noble boy would often be sent away to another castle to serve as a page in a different lord's household. This wasn't just training, it was networking. A page learned manners, swordplay, riding, and how to serve at the table, but he also absorbed the politics of the household he served. It was an early form of apprenticeship, and it taught loyalty, strategy, and observation. Pages might spend years in this position before being promoted to squire, assisting a knight directly. Their days were long, and their mistakes often punished harshly. Discipline was an expected part of life, and it wasn't gentle. Children were corrected with physical punishment, switches, canes, slaps, and shamed for disobedience. Even noble children were not immune. Servants' children often fared worse. The belief was that discipline bred virtue, and a child who was not corrected would grow up foolish, dangerous, or immoral. Laughter was allowed in moderation, but quiet obedience was the gold standard. Girls, meanwhile, were taught how to run a household from a young age. They learned embroidery, music, reading, if lucky, and how to manage servants. Their mothers or female guardians oversaw this training. For noble girls, education in religion and piety was central, and they were expected to become modest, patient, and skilled in the arts of managing a family and hosting guests. While some noble women were literate and even well-educated, this was not the norm, especially for lower-born girls taught by adolescents. A noble girl's value was closely tied to marriage. Her behavior was watched, her appearance scrutinized, and her purity guarded. Servants were often tasked with protecting their young mistresses from scandal or inappropriate contact, and transgressions, real or rumored, could damage a girl's entire future. By age 14 or 15, many noble girls were married off, often to men twice their age or older, in arrangements decided long before they reached maturity. Peasant and servant children living in the castle had a different trajectory. They began working as soon as they could be useful. At 5 or 6 years old, a child might carry water, sweep floors, or help in the kitchens. Education was rare. Most were illiterate, learning by doing how to clean a hearth, carry coal, wash clothes, or tend to animals. Boys might become stable hands or assistants to craftsmen. Girls might help in the kitchens or laundries. Their days were long, their futures uncertain, and their security entirely dependent on remaining useful and unseen. Friendship among castle children did exist, but it was shaped by class. A noble child might have a favorite servant playmate, but the relationship was never equal. One was always the master, the other the follower. Any hint of overfamiliarity could be punished, and such friendships were expected to fade as the noble child grew into their role. Loyalty was prized, but boundaries had to be respected. Play did happen, but it was limited and purposeful. Games often involved strategy, imitation of adult roles, or physical endurance. Wrestling, sword practice, mock battles, and horseplay were encouraged for boys within bounds. Girls might play harp, perform dances, or create embroidery samplers. Downtime was brief and always observed. Even laughter was a privilege, and too much of it was viewed with suspicion. Illness and death were familiar to children. Siblings died. Mothers died in childbirth. Fathers died in battle. Priests whispered last rites in bedrooms and corridors, and everyone learned early what grief sounded like. Death wasn't hidden, it was part of castle life. Children were expected to attend funerals, wear mourning clothes, and recite prayers. The idea was not to protect children from sadness, but to shape them through it. Fear was a constant companion. Fear of failure, fear of punishment, fear of making a mistake in front of someone important. In a world where reputation was everything, and survival often depended on staying in favor, even a child could feel the pressure of status. One wrong word, one misstep, and you could be dismissed, sent away, or humiliated. This fear wasn't always spoken aloud, but it lived in their posture, their bowed heads, their hushed voices. Still, moments of joy found their way in. The first time a page successfully rode a horse, a birthday feast with sweetened pastries, a music lesson that ended in laughter, a shared secret between siblings. Even within the structured, rule-bound world of a castle, children found ways to experience wonder. But these moments were always fleeting. The structure always returned. The training resumed. The expectations tightened again. And while some children did rise, advancing from page to knight, or marrying well and gaining influence, most simply became part of the machinery that kept the castle running. Their childhoods were less about discovering who they were, and more about becoming what. Others expected them to be in the end, Raising children in a medieval castle wasn't about nurturing innocence. It was about preparing them for a life of duty, hierarchy, and constraint. Every game had a lesson. Every mistake had a cost. And every moment of freedom was borrowed from a system that, sooner or later, demanded your return to its rules. In a medieval castle, food wasn't just a matter of sustenance. It was a performance, a hierarchy, and a daily reminder of where you stood in the social order. Meals weren't shared equally, and they weren't merely about hunger. Every crumb, bowl, and cut of meat came with rules, some spoken, many unspoken, and they governed not only what you ate, but when, how, with whom, and why. The result was a deeply unequal culinary system in which food revealed privilege, enforced discipline, and often left many people hungry in the shadows of the feast. Let's start with the layout of meals. The castle's great hall was the primary setting for daily eating, at least for those high enough in rank to dine there. At one end of the hall sat the high table, usually raised on the platform and reserved for the lord, his immediate family, and guests of honor. Below them, in descending order of importance, were the lower tables. Proximity to the high table reflected your status in the household. Sit close and you were important. Sit at the far end near the drafty entrance or the smoky hearth and you knew your rank. But most of the people in the castle didn't eat in the hall at all. Servants, grooms, scullions, cooks, laundresses, and stable boys often ate elsewhere if they ate together at all. Many had to take their meals in kitchens, storage rooms, or outdoor courtyards. Some ate standing up, grabbing a few mouthfuls. Between tasks, their food was not plated, not seasoned, and rarely hot by the time they got to it. They didn't complain because to complain about food was to question your place, and that wasn't done. The timing of meals was fixed and unforgiving. Typically, there were 2 main meals in a day. Dinner, served in mid to late morning, and supper, taken in the evening. Breakfast, as we understand it, wasn't common among nobles and was often viewed as a lower class habit or even a sign of gluttony. If a nobleman did eat in the morning, it was usually light bread, wine, or broth, and rarely formal. For the working staff, however, food was fuel, and an early bite of bread or ale was often essential before hours of labor. The distribution of food followed strict protocols. The steward or seneschal oversaw the kitchen and made sure the correct amounts of each dish went to each table. The most elaborate dishes, roasted game, glazed fowl, spiced stews, were carried with ceremony to the high table. Guests were served by carvers and cupbearers, who followed etiquette manuals dictating how to hold knives, present platters, and pour wine. At lower tables, servants passed along simpler food, sometimes already half cold by the time it arrived. And further down the chain, servants received what was left over, sometimes after the food had already been picked through. What kinds of food were served? At the high table, nobles enjoyed variety and luxury. They dined on roasted boar, venison, fresh caught fish, pies stuffed with goose or pigeon, seasoned vegetables, soft white bread, and sometimes even imported delicacies like citrus fruits or almonds. Their meals were flavored with spices like cinnamon, cloves, saffron, and pepper, expensive ingredients that signified wealth and refinement. These weren't just meals, they were statements. The more exotic and numerous the dishes, the more powerful the host. But while the nobles feasted, the rest of the castle made do with monotony and scarcity. For the lower ranks, food revolved around pottage, a thick stew made of grains, vegetables, and occasionally meat, if it was available. Pottage could be nutritious, but it was bland and repetitive. Bread, often coarse and dark with bits of husk still in it, was a staple. Ale was drunk more than water, since water was often contaminated. And meat was a luxury. Many servants went weeks without tasting any at all. Food waste was another indicator of injustice. The high table produced leftovers, often untouched dishes that were still warm. Some of these made their way to the almonry, where poor people who lived near the castle could come and receive scraps. But not all leftovers trickled down. Some were discarded, fed to dogs, or left to rot. Meanwhile, the kitchen staff worked in smoke, heat, and chaos. often too hungry themselves to pause and eat during the busy meal hours. Religion also shaped the food rules. Fasting days, mandated by the church, were numerous, nearly half the calendar in some regions. On these days, meat was forbidden, and the castle kitchen had to produce meals without it. Nobles substituted fish, cheese, or eggs. But for lower-ranking people, fasting just meant less food. A servant already eating pottage twice a day would now get watery porridge, or a smaller portion than usual. The burden of piety fell hardest. On the stomachs of the poor, feast days were the opposite, but still unfair. These were the rare times when the castle truly came alive with food. Tables groaning under pies, breads, meats, pastries, and sweets. Cooks prepared meals for days in advance. Exotic animals like peacocks or swans were served whole, feathers reattached for display. Guests wore their best. Musicians played. Wine flowed freely, but even here the division was clear. The nobles dined in splendor. The servants served. And any scraps they received were a byproduct of excess, not an invitation to share in celebration. Etiquette around food was another tool of social separation. Nobles used knives and spoons, but forks were rare until much later. Still, even how you held your bread or wiped your mouth was watched. Servants were expected to remain silent unless spoken to, and mistakes at the table, spilling a drink, serving a cold dish, dropping a spoon could result in a scolding, or worse. Training to serve at the table was rigorous because the stakes were high. You weren't just feeding people, you were reinforcing order. Even within the noble family, food reflected internal hierarchy. The lord might receive the first cut of meat. The lady chose next. Children ate in order of age or importance. Younger children often dined in separate quarters with their nursemaids, unless it was a special occasion. A noble son being groomed. For leadership might be allowed to dine at the high table earlier than his siblings. These were subtle signals, but powerful ones. Guests added another layer of complexity. Hospitality was a sacred duty, and hosting nobles, whether friends, allies, or even rivals, required extraordinary planning. Castles were judged by their generosity. Offering too little food or food that wasn't rich or varied enough could be seen as an insult. Offering too much, on the other hand, might cause whispers of wastefulness. The kitchen staff bore the brunt of these expectations, working long hours to roast, boil, bake, and plate everything according to the standards of who might not even remember their names. Health and hygiene in the kitchen were, by modern standards, abysmal. Meat might be kept too long, water drawn from questionable sources, and tools shared without cleaning. Illnesses often spread through shared meals. People didn't know about bacteria, and food poisoning was mistaken for curses or bad luck. Servants who fell ill were often blamed for their own suffering, accused of laziness or unclean habits gotten away. The castle's food system mirrored its power system. The high table had choice, variety, and freedom. The lower you went, the less you had, less flavor, less agency, less certainty. You could live under the same roof, hear the same church bells, and walk the same halls, yet eat like you lived in another world entirely. Hunger was not just a condition, it was a status symbol. Being full meant you mattered. Being hungry meant you didn't, and yet people adapted. Servants shared what little they had, sneaking bread rolls or spoonfuls of stew to each other when the steward wasn't looking. Some grew clever, learning to stretch ingredients, spice leftovers, or save tidbits. Food became not just a way to survive, but to form quiet bonds. A kitchen maid who shared her crusts with a stable boy. A scullion who tucked away a slice of pie for the old laundress. In these small rebellions, humanity persisted, even in the cold calculus of a castle's kitchen. So, while the castle may have been built of stone, its rules were baked into bread, ladled into bowls, and roasted on spits. Food was never just food. It was structure, spectacle, and sometimes subtle cruelty. Where you ate it, and how much you got all told the story of who you were and who you were not. There's a romantic notion that life in a medieval castle involved lounging nights, noble ladies gliding through stone corridors, and minstrels strumming tunes in echoing halls. But this dreamy version skips over the people who made all of it possible, the workers, the servants, the invisible army of men, women, and children whose daily grind kept the castle breathing. And for them, the reality was simple. The work never ended. Not at dawn, not after supper, not even on holy days. If you weren't a lord, your life in a medieval castle was defined by relentless, exhausting, often degrading chores. First, let's talk about the hierarchy of labor. Like everything else in the medieval world, castle work was organized in layers. At the top of the working class were the senior servants, the steward, the chamberlain, the butler, the cook. These individuals held authority over large parts of castle management. Below them were specialized workers, maids, grooms, scullions, laundresses, armorers, stable hands. Then came the lowest tier, the boys who fetched water, the kitchen drudges, who scrubbed pots, and the seasonal laborers who did anything and everything. It wasn't just what you did, it was how visibly low your job was on the ladder. A typical day began before sunrise. If you were a kitchen servant, your first chore might be to revive the fires that had smoldered overnight. These were stone hearths filled with yesterday's ashes, and you had to work quickly because bread had to be made, stew started, and meat prepared. Cooks directed, but didn't often chop or stir. That work fell to scullions who might spend entire days gutting fish, grinding spices, or scrubbing soot from iron pots until their hams cracked. Stable workers had their own world of labor. Horses were valuable assets and needed constant care. You'd rise in the dark to feed and water them, muck out stalls filled with ammonia-reeking straw, brush down their coats, and check their hooves for stones or infection. In rain or snow, the animals still needed walking, bedding, and feeding. Tack had to be cleaned, bridles repaired, carts inspected. If a noble was going hunting or traveling, your job might begin at midnight and last until the master's horse returned home at dusk. Laundries, and cleaning maids faced their own daily torment. Washing clothes wasn't simply throwing linen in a stream. It meant hours of beating fabric against wooden boards, scrubbing with lye or urine, then hauling heavy wet cloth back through narrow corridors and up stone staircases. Bedding was changed only occasionally, but when it was, the scale was immense. Blankets, straw mattresses, curtains, cloaks, all of it dusty, lice-infested, and weighty. And even when there was no washing to do, there were rushes to sweep, furniture to polish, hearths to clean, and floors to scrape. For children and adolescents, chores started early. A page might begin the day folding clothes, fetching water, and helping a knight into armor. A young girl might be tasked with running messages between servants, feeding chickens, or helping prepare herbs for the kitchen. No task was considered too small or too menial. A child's usefulness determined whether they had a future in the castle. Mistakes, spilling milk, breaking a cup, delivering the wrong message could cost them that future. Night work was its own class of suffering. Guards and watchmen had to patrol the walls and gates. Fires needed tending in the halls and chambers. Servants worked in shifts to stay awake in case their lords needed anything. Hot water, a chamber pot emptied, a message sent by torchlight. If someone fell ill in the night, a servant might be roused from their sleep pallet to carry water or fetch a healer. Sleep was never guaranteed. You could be woken at any hour, for any reason, and expected to perform your duties without complaint. And let's not forget the toilets. Castles used garderobe stone chutes that funneled waste down into cesspits or open moats, but these weren't self-cleaning. Someone had to maintain them. Servants were expected to clean the stone seats, remove blockages, and empty chamber. Pots from bedrooms. The smell was unbearable. The task was dangerous, involving slippery steps, filthy water, and potential illness. It was one of the least respected jobs in the castle, and therefore one of the most common for the lowest ranking staff. What made all of this worse was the lack of choice. If you worked in a castle, you didn't get to pick your job. You were born into a position or given one based on availability, family connections, or sheer desperation. There was little mobility. A kitchen maid didn't become a cook unless someone died. A stable boy might spend his whole life shoveling dung unless he found a way to get out, or unless he was particularly clever and incredibly lucky. The conditions were terrible. Castle interiors were smoky, drafty, and crowded. The stone walls, sweated in winter and baked in summer. Kitchens were hot and airless. Stables reeked. Servant dormitories were crammed with straw, pallets, and shared blankets. Lice, fleas, and illness were common. Soap was rare. Medical care was primitive. If you cut your hand while chopping meat and it got infected, you might lose your fingers or your life. But the work didn't stop. You were expected to keep going until you dropped. Holidays and holy days offered little respite. Even on religious feast days, servants still worked. In fact, they often worked more, preparing massive meals, setting up decorations, or hosting guests. A rest day for the lords meant extra labor for the staff. Priests might bless the food and offer prayers, but that didn't lighten anyone's load. And heaven help you if the Lord decided to go hunting or traveling on a holy day. That meant early packing, long hours, and a parade of logistics support a journey that brought no pleasure to you at all. Even pregnant women and the elderly weren't exempt from labor. A maid who felt pregnant might be expected to work until childbirth. Some were dismissed or hidden away. Older workers with bad backs or poor eyesight were given the worst. Most repetitive tasks: shelling peas, mending linens, cleaning floors. They were often half forgotten, unless they made mistakes or gotten away. There were no pensions, no retirement. You worked until you physically couldn't, and then you hoped someone younger would show you mercy. And all of this toil was done largely invisibly. Lords rarely spoke to servants unless giving orders. Noble guests might not even know the names of those who dressed them or fed them. Work was meant to be quiet, efficient, and unseen. The more smoothly the castle functioned, the more invisible. The workers became. Their reward for success was continued labor. Their punishment for failure was humiliation, dismissal, or worse. Still, amidst the drudgery, communities formed. Servants supported each other. They shared jokes, bread, and sympathy. They passed down knowledge how to clean without being seen, how to avoid certain overseers, how to find 5 minutes of rest in a 14-hour day. For many, the castle was both prison and home, a place of constant labor, but also shared survival, because that's what life in the castle was for anyone who wasn't a lord. It wasn't a romantic medieval drama. It was backbreaking, relentless, and unfair. But it was also where generations of ordinary people carved out lives amid stone walls, soot-blackened ceilings, and a social order that never let them forget. Their work was never finished, and their comfort never got in modern life. The idea of walking away from a bad job, a harsh environment, or an unfair situation is built into our assumptions about freedom. If things get too hard, you can quit, move, start over. But in a medieval castle, that luxury did not exist for most people. Once you were in sometimes for life. Leaving wasn't just frowned upon. It was often impossible. The castle wasn't just a place you lived or worked, it was a social, economic, and psychological trap. Let's begin with the physical realities. Castles were often isolated, built on hilltops, surrounded by thick forests, rivers, moats, or walls. Travel was dangerous. Roads were muddy, unmarked, and filled with risks. Bandits, wild animals, or patrols who might question your presence. Even if you wanted to leave, you couldn't just stroll out the front gate. Many castles had guards at every entrance. And if you were a servant, leaving without permission was seen as desertion. If caught, you could be whipped, branded, or dragged back in chains. But the more powerful trap was economic. Most castle workers weren't paid a regular wage. They were compensated with food, shelter, clothing, and the vague promise of protection. Some senior staff might earn coins or favors, but for most, leaving the castle meant leaving behind everything. There was no savings account, no property of your own. If you walked away, you walked into poverty and homelessness. For a woman, that might mean prostitution. For a man, vagrancy. Both were crimes. Even if you did earn a small wage, the job market was non-existent. Outside the castle walls, peasants were tied to land through feudal obligations. Towns had guilds that were close to outsiders. Monasteries offered strict religious life, not freedom. The idea of finding another job simply didn't apply. Skills didn't translate easily. Being a scullion didn't qualify you to farm. Being a laundress didn't get you into a craft guild. You were trained for your role in the castle, and that's where you were expected to stay. Legal restrictions made it worse. In many cases, castle servants were technically serfs bound to a lord and required to serve unless officially released. If a lord gave you permission to leave, you needed documentation. If you left without it, you were a fugitive. Other lords or towns might refuse to shelter you. Word traveled. A runaway was not just disobedient, they were a threat to the feudal order. So even if you escaped, you were always at risk of being found and returned. Social pressure also held. People in place. In the castle, you were part of a known community. Even if the work was hard, you knew your duties, your neighbors, your place. Outside the castle, you were a nobody. Leaving meant leaving behind your network, your family, your friends, your protection. Many people feared what they didn't, no more than what they did. Even those who dreamed of leaving rarely tried, and the church reinforced this trap. Religious teachings emphasized obedience, humility, and acceptance of one's lot in life. Suffering was seen as a virtue, a path to holiness. If you were a servant, you were meant to serve. If you were lowborn, you were meant to be humble. Discontent was considered prideful. Priests might even preach sermons about the dangers of wandering too far from one's rightful station. To leave your post was not just risky, it was sinful. For women, the trap was even tighter. A woman who tried to leave her castle role without a husband, family, or permission could be accused of immorality or witchcraft. Single women on the road were viewed with suspicion. Many were attacked or pressed into unsavory roles just to survive. The castle may have been strict, but it offered some protection. And the fear of what lay beyond its walls often kept women exactly where they were, no matter how unhappy. Then there were the psychological chains. If you were born into castle life, say the child of a cook or a stable master, you grew up believing that this life was all there was. You didn't dream of traveling the world or breaking free. You dreamed of one day being promoted to head cook or lead groom. The horizon was close and narrow. Few people ever saw more than a few miles beyond the castle, and those who left rarely returned to say what it was like out there, which made it seem even more dangerous than it was. Stories of escape did circulate, whispered among servants late at night. A page who ran off and joined a band of minstrels. A maid who vanished during a feast and was never found. A blacksmith who saved enough to buy land in a nearby village. But these tales were rare and usually ended in tragedy or ambiguity. No one knew if the escaped maid found freedom or ended up in a ditch. Hope was measured, not blazing. And even those who did leave didn't always find happiness. A former servant might struggle to find work in a town. A disobedient squire might discover he lacked the training to be anything outside his knight's shadow. Some returned to the castle, humbled, and were allowed back usually at a lower status. Others simply disappeared from memory. Meanwhile, the castle relied on this immobility. Lords didn't want their staff constantly rotating or abandoning ship. They needed loyalty, stability. A servant who had been with the family for 20 years was more valuable than 5 who had come and gone. So the system was designed to discourage movement. Promotions were rare, but so were firings unless you made a major mistake. You were expected to be as permanent as the stones in the wall. In some cases, loyalty was rewarded. A long-serving steward might be given a small cottage on the grounds. A favored maid might be married off to a trusted servant and allowed to raise children within the castle. These gestures were rare but powerful. They sent a message. Stay long enough, and you might carve out a life here. It won't be luxurious. It won't be free. But it will be yours. So no, you couldn't just leave. Not physically, not economically, not socially, not spiritually. You were bound by duty, fear, habit, and hope. And even if you dreamed of escape, chances are you woke the next day, rolled out of your straw pallet, and went back to work. Because in medieval castle, the idea of freedom was as distant as the horizon, and sometimes even further, it's easy to imagine a medieval castle as a fortress of safety, big stone walls, towering battlements, guards at every gate. From the outside, it was a symbol of power and protection. But once you were inside, things weren't nearly as secure as they appeared. Beneath the surface of chivalry, honor, and order, castle life was tangled with secrets, whispers, and ever-present danger. Castles were not safe. They were pressure cookers of suspicion, betrayal, and quietly simmering crime. Start with the most basic truth. Everyone lived too close together. Dozens, sometimes hundreds, of people shared the same tight space. Nobles, servants, soldiers, tradesmen, priests. They slept in clustered chambers, shared smoky hearths, passed each other in narrow stone corridors. Privacy was almost non-existent. Eavesdropping was easy. Gossip spread like smoke through arrow slits. If something went wrong, a theft, a missing letter, an affair, it was nearly impossible to keep it hidden for long. And nearly everyone had something to hide. Crime in the castle didn't always look like robbery or murder. It was subtler. Pay. Theft was the most common. A servant slipping a coin from a noble's chamber. A cook sneaking extra food. A guard keeping part of someone else's payment. In a world where most people had little or nothing, the temptation to take a little more was constant. And while the punishment for theft could be severe whipping, branding, or even mutilation, the system didn't always catch the guilty. Accusations were often based on suspicion, not evidence. Justice was swift, but not necessarily fair. Then there were more dangerous offenses. Forgery, especially of letters or seals, could threaten lives. False messages might summon enemies. Cancel shipments or undo delicate alliances. The use of wax seals made such crimes possible and difficult to trace. Intercepted letters were a key source of power, and many castle dwellers made quiet livings passing messages for the right price, trusting your scribe or messenger entirely. That was a gamble. Betrayal came in many forms. Servants could be bribed to share information about their lord's plans, the contents of his treasury, or the identity of a guest staying in secret. Maids could be coaxed into revealing overheard conversations. Grooms might be paid to damage a rival's horse. Sometimes the betrayer wasn't a stranger, but a relative, a brother angling for inheritance, a cousin spying for a rival lord. Loyalty was expected but rarely assumed. And of course, spying was institutionalized. During times of war or political tension, rival houses sent spies into each other's castles disguised as servants, scribes, or even entertainers. These infiltrators weren't James Bond-style saboteurs. They were listeners, observers, people trained to blend in, collect bits of gossip, piece together truth from half sentences. A juggler might overhear plans during a feast. A laundress might read notes while washing linens. A stable hand might track which guests were leaving in the dead of night. It didn't take a dagger to do damage, a well-timed word in the right ear could spark war. Religious officials could be dangerous in their own right. Priests heard confessions, sometimes of crime, sometimes of treason. They were expected to keep such confessions secret. But priests were also human. Some leaked what they heard. Others used it as leverage. In castles with chapel staff, the line between holy man and informant could be razor thin. A suspicious lord might rely more on his priest's gossip than his steward's reports. Even soldiers and guards were not always loyal. Some were mercenaries, hired blades, whose loyalty ended with their payment. If a rival lord offered more gold, they might look the other way at a crucial moment. Others were simply resentful. Castle guards lived rough lives, exposed to weather, constantly alert and not particularly well treated. A grudge could fester. An insult from a noble, a missed payment, a brother punished unjustly, these could all lead a guard to betrayal. Loyalty could be bought, but it could also be lost. Murder, while rare, did happen, not just in drunken fights or jealous quarrels, though. Those occurred two but calculated, planned acts. A poisoning in a cup of wine. A fall from a tower that no one quite witnessed. A fire in a storeroom that happened to start near someone's sleeping place. Most murders weren't officially solved. They were quietly spoken of, buried or blamed on accidents or God's will. But behind closed doors, the truth was often known. Castles were also vulnerable to outside betrayal. A gatekeeper bribed to leave a door unlocked. A soldier who dropped a rope from the tower at night. A servant who guided attackers through secret passages. Castles were full of weak points, and the people who knew them best were often the lowest ranked. Ones who had cleaned the oubliettes, stocked the wine cellars, or climbed into the attics. Their knowledge was dangerous, and in times of siege or rebellion, it could be sold. Even when there wasn't war, power struggles happened internally. Rivalries between noble families spilled into castle corridors. A new wife might try to push out the old steward. A returning son might try to claim the household keys from his uncle. Servants picked sides. Gossip turned into schemes. Alliances were forged in whispered conversations and broken by accidents that were maybe not accidents. You never really knew who was on your side. And trust was a dangerous currency. False accusations were their own kind of crime. In a place where everyone watched everyone else, it was easy to point a finger. A servant might accuse another of theft just to remove competition. A jealous maid might claim someone was spreading rumors. Lords might accuse rivals of treason to justify taking their lands. And because justice in a castle was usually served by the lord himself or someone he appointed, truth mattered less than power. Punishments were public and harsh. Thieves might be locked in stocks in the courtyard. Spies might be executed without trial. Betrayers, if caught, could be mutilated, hanged, or thrown into dungeons where they disappeared without a trace. The point wasn't just to punish. It was to remind everyone that the walls of the castle were not just defensive, they were enclosing. You were being watched, and so people walked carefully. They lowered their voices. They stepped aside when nobles passed. They avoided speaking ill of their masters, even in whispers. Smiling at the wrong person might be seen as familiarity. Avoiding someone might seem suspicious. People learned to speak in hints and metaphors, to nod instead of reply. The castle taught silence as much as service. Despite all of this, some tried to play the game. Servants who gathered secrets might trade them for favor. A stable boy who overheard a knight's indiscretion might suddenly find himself promoted. A chambermaid who discovered a secret letter might earn a gold coin or her freedom. Information was power, and in a castle, even the powerless could sometimes wield it, but it was never safe. Not really. Because once you were seen as dangerous once, someone suspected you of knowing too much, you became expendable. Trusted servants vanished. Friendly guards were transferred. A maid who had always smiled at you might stop meeting your gaze. The rules of the castle could change without warning. And those who climbed the ladder on secrets often fell the hardest. So while the outside world may have feared the castle's strength, those inside feared its secrets. And perhaps most chilling. Of all, there was no escape from it. You lived within those walls, worked within those rules, and navigated those tensions. And all the while, you never stopped wondering who was listening. And what they were planning to do with what they heard. A medieval castle, for all its towering stone walls and defensive brilliance, was never truly invincible. Despite the moats, drawbridges, murder holes, and fortified gates, castles were not immune to collapse. And when they did fall, it wasn't always a dramatic battle with flaming arrows and battering rams. It was often a long, slow, grinding ordeal that tested every human limit. The fall of a castle was not just a military defeat. It was a total unraveling of life, one miserable day at a time. Let's begin with the dreaded word, siege. In medieval warfare, besieging a castle was far more common than storming it. Why risk your men against high walls and boiling oil when you could just surround the place and wait? Sieges could last weeks, months, even years. The goal was starvation, desperation, and surrender, not bloodshed, at least not right away. Once the castle's supplies ran out, its fall was inevitable. Inside the castle, life changed immediately. Food was rationed. Guards doubled their watches. Cooks scoured pantries, measuring dried beans, stale bread, salted meat. Fresh produce disappeared within days, ale soured. Rats became less of a nuisance and more of a potential meal. Servants were ordered to stretch ingredients pottage with more water, fewer vegetables, or no meat at all. Everyone began to go hungry. The first to suffer were the lowest ranked servants, while the lord and his household ate the dwindling supplies of better food. Others were given crusts, watered down stew, or nothing at all. Weakness spread quickly. A laundress fainted at her work. A stable boy collapsed while carrying buckets. Children cried through the night. The mood inside the castle darkened. Thick with fear and fatigue, hot water became a crisis of its own. If the castle had a well, it was guarded closely. But if the siege lasted long enough, even the cleanest water turned foul. Wells went dry. Rain. Barrels emptied. People boiled water from the moat-murky, disease-ridden water that tasted of filth. Illness spread. Diarrhea, fever, vomiting, no one was spared. Hygiene vanished. Chamber pots overflowed. The stench of bodies, rot, and smoke filled the air. Meanwhile, outside the enemy waited. They taunted. They built siege engines, trebuchets, and catapults to hurl stones or rotting animal carcasses over the walls. These weren't just weapons. They were psychological tools. The bodies of diseased animals, or sometimes people, were launched into courtyards to spread plague and panic. Nights were filled with the groan of wood, the thud of impact, and the whispered prayers of those who didn't know if they'd survive until morning dawned within the castle. Morale collapsed slowly. Loyalty frayed. Servants began to question their duties. Guards snapped at each other. Even the noble family began to fray under the pressure. The Lord grew silent. His lady spent her hours in chapel. Children clung to nursemaids and asked why the sky was full of smoke. People dreamed of escape, but the gates were sealed. The only way out was surrender. Or death. Mutiny became a real threat. Hungry guards might be bribed to open a gate. A desperate servant might try to slip away under cover of darkness, only to be caught and executed as a traitor. Whispers of surrender spread like infection. Some begged the Lord to yield. Others insisted on fighting to the end. Every decision became a gamble. Eventually, the animals were eaten. Horses, dogs, pigeons, then rats. Then leather-boiled boots and belts chewed into submission. People turned hollow-eyed, skeletal. The strong collapsed. The weak died. And the castle chapel hosted daily prayers, but even the priests looked gaunt. Hunger became a hallucination, then a quiet madness. Surrender, when it came, was not always merciful. A wise besieger might offer terms. Lay down your arms, open the gates, and the lives of non-combatants will be spared. But that depended on politics, grudges, and luck. Some castles were spared. Others were slaughtered to the last servant. Soldiers rushed in, swords drawn, and the massacre began in stairwells and kitchens. No one was safe. No one was immune. Looting followed. Storerooms were emptied. Tapestries ripped from walls. Jewels stolen. Wine barrels cracked open. The castle was picked clean, like a carcass. Survivors, if any, were left among the rubble, bruised and broken, unsure of what came next. The Lord, if not executed, might be paraded through the enemy camp as a trophy. His family imprisoned, his name stripped of power. And then came the silence. A once thriving fortress reduced to ruin. Fire smoldering in the hall. Blood drying in the rushes. Doors left open to the wind. Birds returning to the walls. What had once been a symbol of safety now stood hollowed out, defeated. But not all castle falls were the result of war. Sometimes it was internal decay that did the job. A series of bad harvests, a plague, economic collapse, a noble family's debts, spiraling out of control. The servants were let go. The guard thinned. Supplies dried up. The rooms went unused, cold and quiet. The castle became a shadow of itself, not with a bang, but with a long, slow whimper. Walls crumbled. Roofs leaked. Time did what no army could dot to outsiders. A fallen castle might seem like an event, a story, a line in a chronicle. But to those who lived inside, it was a personal apocalypse. Days turned to nightmares. Meals became memories. Hope faded until all that remained was the wish to survive just one more day. And when that too was gone, all that was left was surrender. Because for all its grandeur and might, a castle was only as strong as the people inside it. And when they broke starved, sickened, or betrayed, the castle fell just as surely as if the walls had been made of straw.